Long before the idea of the United States ever existed, before the stars and stripes, the Constitution or the Founding Fathers, there were people here for tens of thousands of years. The lands that would one day be called America were home to thriving and diverse civilizations. These indigenous peoples built cities, developed complex social and spiritual systems, and created vast trade networks that spanned the continent. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved intricate dwellings into the cliff sides of what is now New Mexico. Colorado, Utah, and Arizona, they constructed kivas, ceremonial spaces, and interconnected homes with elaborate engineering. Further east, the Mississippian culture constructed massive earth mounds. At its height, the city of Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, boasted a population that may have rivaled that of London during the same era. This city was a center of trade, politics, and culture, home to monumental structures like Monk's Mound and surrounded by defensive wooden palisades. To the north, the Iroquois Confederacy formed one of the most sophisticated political alliances in pre-Columbian North America. Comprised of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, this league promoted peace and cooperative governance among its member tribes. Along the Pacific coast, tribes like the Tlingit, Haida, and Chinook built longhouses, totem poles, and developed rich oral traditions that passed down history through generations. The plains were home to nomadic tribes who followed bison herds, while in the southeast, groups like the Cherokee and Creek formed agricultural societies with permanent settlements. This land was not an empty wilderness. It was a place of vibrant civilizations, each with its own language, traditions, and worldview. In 1492, this world began to change. Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish flag, arrived in the Caribbean. Though he never set foot on the North American mainland, his voyage triggered waves of exploration and colonization that would alter the continent forever. Spanish explorers soon pushed into what is now the southern United States, establishing missions and forts throughout Florida, Texas, New Mexico, and California. They encountered vast native populations and frequently sought to convert them to Christianity, often by force. In the early 17th century, the English began to establish permanent settlements along the Atlantic coast. In 1607, the Virginia Company founded Jamestown, the first successful English colony. Harsh conditions, famine, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy nearly destroyed the colony, but tobacco farming eventually made it profitable. In 1620, a group of English religious separatists known as the Pilgrims arrived aboard the Mayflower and founded Plymouth Colony in present-day Massachusetts. More English colonies followed, each with its own character, economy, and relationship with native peoples. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, 13 English colonies took root along the eastern seaboard. New England became a center of shipping and trade. The middle colonies, like New York and Pennsylvania, blended commerce, agriculture, and religious diversity. The southern colonies developed plantation economies built on slave labor, producing crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. The presence of European colonists brought disease, displacement, and war to Native American communities. Entire nations were decimated by smallpox and other illnesses, for which they had no immunity. As settlers pushed westward, conflicts erupted, most notably King Philip's War in New England, a devastating conflict between native confederacies and colonists. By the mid-18th century, the British colonies in North America had developed distinctive identities. They were largely self-governed, but remained loyal to the British Crown. This relationship would soon deteriorate. The French and Indian War, fought between Britain and France from 1754 to 1763, was part of a larger global conflict. In North America, the war pitted British and colonial forces against French troops and their native allies. Britain emerged victorious, but was left with a staggering war debt. To recover financially, the British government imposed new taxes on its American colonies. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, without giving the colonists a voice in Parliament. This lack of representation sparked outrage. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed through the colonies. Resistance took many forms, from pamphlets and petitions to protests and boycotts. In 1773, colonists in Boston boarded British ships and dumped crates of tea into the harbor in what became known as the Boston Tea Party. Britain responded with harsh, punitive laws, dubbed the Intolerable Acts. Tensions escalated. In April 1775, British troops clashed with colonial militias at Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. In 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence from Britain. Authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence articulated ideals of liberty and self-governance. Though these were inconsistently applied, slavery and exclusion persisted. The war lasted 8 grueling years. George Washington, a Virginian planter and military leader, commanded the Continental Army. Though often outgunned and under-resourced, American forces used guerrilla tactics and benefited from French support, particularly after the pivotal victory at Saratoga. In 1781, British General Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. But independence was only the beginning. The new nation faced a host of challenges. The first system of government, the Articles of Confederation, proved too weak. It gave the federal government no power to levy taxes or regulate commerce. In 1787, delegates convened in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. After months of debate and compromise, they produced a framework that established a strong federal government with checks and balances among 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. In 1789, George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. The new government set important precedents: peaceful transfer of power, a Bill of Rights to safeguard liberties, and debates over how to interpret the Constitution. Political factions emerged: Federalists who favored strong central power, and Democratic Republicans who championed states' rights. The country began to expand. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the nation's size. The Lewis and Clark expedition followed, charting a path to the Pacific and recording details of geography, flora, and native tribes. Expansion was framed as manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to spread across the continent. This belief fueled settlement, but also violence and displacement. Native Americans were pushed off their lands. In the 1830s, the Indian Removal Act forced thousands from their ancestral homes. The infamous Trail of Tears saw the Cherokee and other tribes forcibly relocated westward, with thousands dying from exposure, starvation, and disease. Meanwhile, the economy and society of the United States were evolving. The North became increasingly industrialized, building factories, railroads, and cities. The South remained rooted in agriculture, dependent on enslaved African Americans to sustain its cotton economy. The question of whether slavery would spread into new Western territories became a flashpoint. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Though he initially sought only to halt the expansion of slavery, Southern states saw his election as a threat to their way of life. 11 states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. In 1861, the Civil War began. The war lasted 4 brutal years. It was the deadliest conflict in American history, claiming over 600,000 lives. Major battles at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh left deep scars. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, declaring freedom for enslaved people in rebel states. In 1865, the Union prevailed. Lincoln, however, would not live to see the aftermath. He was assassinated just days after the war ended. The post-war period, known as Reconstruction, aimed to rebuild the South and integrate freed slaves into American society. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship, and protected voting rights. But Reconstruction faced fierce resistance. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities. Southern states passed Jim Crow laws, enforcing racial segregation. The federal government eventually withdrew troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and leaving many of its promises unfulfilled. In the late 19th century, the United States entered a period of immense transformation. Known as the Gilded Age, this era was marked by rapid industrialization, vast wealth accumulation, and profound social changes. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, linking distant regions and facilitating the movement of goods, people, and ideas. Cities swelled as immigrants from Europe arrived in waves, fleeing poverty, persecution, and war in search of opportunity. The steel industry, led by Andrew Carnegie, and the oil industry, dominated by John D. Rockefeller, became symbols of both American ingenuity and excess. Tycoons amassed enormous fortunes, while factory workers, including women and children, toiled in dangerous conditions for low wages. Labor unions began to form, demanding fair pay, reasonable hours, and safer workplaces. Strikes erupted across the country, some peaceful, others violent. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 and the Pullman Strike of 1894 highlighted tensions between labor and capital. Alongside industrial expansion came technological innovation. Inventors like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell introduced the electric light bulb and the telephone, respectively. Urban centers saw the rise of skyscrapers, streetcars, and modern sewage systems. Yet for many Americans, especially African Americans and immigrants, the promise of progress remained elusive. Racial discrimination persisted in both law and practice. In the South, Jim Crow laws institutionalized segregation, disenfranchisement, and inequality. Lynchings and racially motivated violence were common. Despite this, black communities built schools, churches, and businesses, laying the groundwork for future civil rights struggles. The closing of the western frontier around 1890 marked another turning point. Native American resistance had been crushed in a series of bloody conflicts, including the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Wounded Knee Massacre. With indigenous peoples confined to reservations, the government promoted assimilation policies through boarding schools and the outlawing of traditional customs. At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States began to project power overseas. In 1898, the Spanish-American War resulted in the U.S. acquiring territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The nation's global ambitions grew. The Panama Canal was constructed to facilitate trade and naval movement. President Theodore Roosevelt's foreign policy, summarized by the phrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," emphasized military strength and American influence abroad. Domestically, the progressive era sought to address the excesses of the Gilded Age. Reformers campaigned against political corruption, unsafe working conditions, and public health hazards. Muckraking journalists exposed scandals and abuses, leading to significant reforms. The Food and Drug Act, the breakup of monopolies, and women's suffrage movements gained traction. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women the right to vote. Soon after, however, the nation faced new challenges. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, joining the Allied powers in a global conflict that had already claimed millions of lives. Though American involvement was relatively short, it proved decisive. U.S. troops helped turn the tide of the war. At home, the war effort mobilized the economy and redefined gender roles, as women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The war ended in 1918, but peace proved fragile. President Woodrow Wilson's vision for a League of Nations was rejected by the Senate, and the U.S. retreated into isolationism. The 1920s brought economic prosperity for some and cultural upheaval for all. Known as the Roaring Twenties, the decade saw the rise of jazz, speakeasies, flappers, and the Harlem Renaissance. It also witnessed a resurgence of nativism, prohibition, and racial violence, notably the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. Then came the crash. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed, triggering the Great Depression. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and millions lost homes and savings. Shantytowns, known as Hoovervilles, sprang up across the country. The crisis demanded new solutions. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. His New Deal programs aimed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. Agencies like the WPA, CCC, and Social Security Administration were created. The federal government took an active role in managing the economy, regulating banks and supporting workers. While the New Deal didn't end the Depression entirely, it restored public confidence and redefined the relationship between government and citizens. As the nation struggled with economic recovery, storm clouds gathered overseas. In the 1930s, fascism rose in Europe and militarism in Asia. Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany, and Japan invaded China. The US remained officially neutral, but gradually increased support for the Allies. Everything changed. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into World War II. The country mobilized on a massive scale. Factories converted to produce tanks, planes, and weapons. Women filled industrial jobs left vacant by men who went to fight. The war effort united the nation, but also exposed its contradictions. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps. African American soldiers fought abroad while facing segregation at home. The Allied victory in 1945 reshaped the world. Nazi Germany was defeated, and the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. In the Pacific, the US dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing Japan's surrender, but also unleashing a new era of nuclear weapons. In the war's aftermath, the United States emerged as a global superpower. The Soviet Union, once an ally, became a rival. Thus began the Cold War, a period of geopolitical tension, ideological competition, and proxy conflicts. The US supported capitalist democracies. The USSR backed communist regimes. Neither side engaged in direct war, but they battled through influence, espionage, and third-party wars in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Domestically, the post-war years brought prosperity for many. The GI Bill expanded access to education and home ownership. Suburbs grew. Consumer culture flourished. Yet not all shared in the boom. Racial segregation and inequality persisted. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, challenged systemic racism and demanded justice. Major victories were achieved. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the franchise. Yet resistance remained strong, and progress was often met with violence. The Vietnam War divided the nation. Initially supported by Cold War logic, the conflict grew unpopular as casualties mounted and television brought its horrors into American homes. Protests erupted on college campuses and in city streets. The 1968 assassinations of MLK and Robert F. Kennedy added to a sense of national crisis. The 1970s brought further turmoil. The Watergate scandal exposed corruption at the highest levels, leading to President Richard Nixon's resignation. An oil crisis, inflation, and economic stagnation challenged the post-war order. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan ushered in a new conservative era. His administration promoted tax cuts, deregulation, and a hardline stance against the Soviet Union. Military spending soared, and the rhetoric of freedom was deployed globally. By 1991, the USSR collapsed. The Cold War ended without direct conflict between the two superpowers. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States stood as the world's lone superpower. The 1990s were marked by economic growth, technological innovation, and relative global stability. The internet revolutionized communication, commerce, and culture. Globalization expanded markets and interconnected economies. But on September 11, 2001, the country was shaken. Coordinated terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda destroyed the World Trade Center, damaged the Pentagon, and killed thousands. In response, the United States launched the War on Terror, invading Afghanistan and later Iraq. These conflicts would become the longest wars in American history, with lasting consequences at home and abroad. The post-9/11 era redefined American politics and global strategy. The Department of Homeland Security was created, surveillance increased, and airport security intensified. In Afghanistan, the US sought to dismantle the Taliban and eliminate Al-Qaeda. In Iraq, the government of Saddam Hussein was toppled in 2003, amid controversial claims about weapons of mass destruction. Though both missions achieved initial military success, the long-term occupation proved costly. Insurgencies erupted, sectarian violence grew, and thousands of American lives were lost alongside hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties. At home, debates raged over torture, drone strikes, and executive power. Meanwhile, the American economy faced new pressures. In 2008, a financial crisis struck, caused in part by risky lending practices, deregulation, and the collapse of major financial institutions. The Great Recession followed. Millions lost jobs, homes, and retirement savings. The federal government intervened with massive bailouts and stimulus programs. President Barack Obama, elected in 2008 as the nation's first black president, inherited the crisis. His administration passed the Affordable Care Act, reformed Wall Street oversight, and oversaw a gradual recovery. Yet partisan polarization deepened, and political gridlock became commonplace. Obama's presidency was historic not only for its symbolism, but also for its reflection of a shifting nation. Demographics were changing. Immigration, both legal and undocumented, became a flashpoint. Social attitudes on marriage equality, marijuana legalization, and gender identity evolved rapidly. Movements like Black Lives Matter challenged police brutality and systemic racism. Mass shootings from Sandy Hook to Orlando to Las Vegas shocked the conscience and sparked fierce debate about gun control and mental health. In 2016, a wave of populism disrupted the political landscape. Donald Trump, a businessman and reality TV personality with no prior political experience, won the presidency on a message of anti-elitism, nationalism, and economic protectionism. His administration took an aggressive stance on immigration, withdrew from international agreements, and reshaped the federal judiciary. Supporters praised his willingness to confront the establishment. Critics decried his rhetoric, divisiveness, and attacks on democratic norms. In 2020, the world was hit by a once-in-a-century pandemic. COVID-19 spread rapidly, overwhelming hospitals and killing over 1 million Americans. Lockdowns, mask mandates, and economic shutdowns redefined everyday life. The pandemic also exposed deep inequalities in healthcare, employment, and access to resources. Schools closed. Millions lost jobs. Political disputes over science and public health turned deadly serious. That same year, the killing of George Floyd, a black man, by a white police officer in Minneapolis, ignited nationwide protests, the movement against racial injustice and police. Violence brought millions into the streets. Calls for reform and accountability spread globally. The election of 2020 took place amid this unrest. Alongside record voter turnout and misinformation campaigns, Joe Biden won the presidency, pledging to restore unity, fight the pandemic, and rebuild alliances. The January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol by pro-Trump rioters marked a turning point. For the first time since the War of 1812, the Capitol was breached by hostile forces, this time domestic. The event exposed the fragility of American democracy and the dangerous power of misinformation. In the following years, America faced complex challenges. Climate change brought wildfires, hurricanes, and droughts with increasing frequency. Political polarization worsened, affecting everything from public health policy to foreign relations. Yet innovation persisted. The COVID-19 vaccine was developed in record time. New advances in artificial intelligence, space exploration, and green energy hinted at the next frontier. The American economy shifted again as remote work. Automation and digital infrastructure became central. Education systems adapted. Mental health concerns rose, Debates over freedom of speech, online censorship, and corporate influence intensified. Through all of this, the story of America continued to evolve, a nation built on ideals yet marked by contradictions. Its founding promise of liberty and justice for all remained unfulfilled for many, but was constantly reinterpreted, challenged, and reasserted by new generations. From the vast, mound-building cultures of pre-Columbian times to the cyber frontiers of the 21st century, America's history is one of continuity and disruption. Waves of people, native, enslaved, immigrant, and settler, have shaped its character. Wars and protests, invention and reform, have forged a nation that is both powerful and imperfect. Today, America stands at a crossroads. It possesses immense wealth, unmatched cultural influence, and enduring democratic traditions. But it also faces rising inequality, political extremism, and existential threats from climate change to technological upheaval. As it moves further into the 21st century, the questions that have always defined it: who belongs? What is freedom? What is the role of government? Remain unresolved. Yet the pursuit of answers, the struggle to improve, and the resilience of its people continue. The history of America is not merely a chronicle of events, but a living, breathing endeavor. It is a story still being written by citizens who challenge, protest, build, innovate, and dream. This is the journey of a nation. Its past is vast and complicated. Its future, as always, is uncertain, but full of possibility.